Want to see how I would design a warship? Grab your copies of both Spacedock reference books about fighters and frigates on our Patreon through the link in the description or pinned comment below. Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Hujuana and today we are examining one of the most exciting and pivotal events from the Ronald D. Moore Battlestar Galactica series, the Battle of New Caprica from the opening arc of Season 3. We're going to cover the capabilities of the participants and their goals, break down the battle itself, and then look back and see how well it worked from a narrative point of view. But first, some context. New Caprica was a habitable planet enshrouded within a sensor-blocking nebula, making it the perfect place for the displaced colonial fleet to hide from their Cylon pursuers. But a year after settling there, the Cylons suddenly appeared in orbit. The two warships that protected the colonial fleet were combat ineffective as much of their crew complement was on leave on the planet, so they were forced to jump away, to return at some indeterminate point in the future. As retaking the planet was a practical impossibility, the only course of action open to Admiral William Adama was to evacuate the settlers using the ships landed on the planet. Unfortunately, he had very few assets available to execute this goal. His own ship was the Battlestar Galactica, an old ship from the First Cylon War more than 40 years earlier. Having had much, but not all, of its kinetic weapons and heavy armor removed, the ship was long past its heyday. Her starboard flight pod had even been converted into a museum. The second warship in the fleet was the Battlestar Pegasus, built after the war and commanded by the Admiral's son, Lee Adama. She carried far more weapons and a much larger air wing, and many of its systems could be automated, reducing its crew requirement compared to older vessels. There were also manufacturing facilities aboard for producing new aircraft. Luckily, both Battlestars still had their air wings aboard, featuring both Viper fighters and multi-role Raptors for support. But with so many crew members on the planet, neither ship could operate at anywhere near full capability. The upside of the high number of trained military personnel on the ground was that the occupying Cylon forces had to contend with an intractable insurgency. Led by Colonel Tai, they hid in underground tunnels and used explosives to strike at key targets, preparing for the return of the Admiral by keeping the occupiers distracted. They even had a high-level contact within the Cylon's sham government feeding them intel. The Cylon ground forces were made up of deadly Centurions stationed all over the city, both on the ground and in armoured guard towers. They also had fortified the central building in the city to use as a detention centre, and it was here that the launch keys for the Colonial's landed ships were stored. The settlers could not leave the surface without these keys, and new ones could not be made. In the skies above were constant patrols by raiders and heavy raiders, craft that the lightly armed insurgency had no real answer for. Even worse, there was a constant presence of at least two base ships in orbit, large Cylon warships armed with huge numbers of missiles and yet more raiders. While primarily designed for orbital bombardment, base ships, also known as base stars, were still formidable opponents in direct combat. The consequences of a failed rescue were dire. The Cylons were already committing a slow but steady genocide on the human population, and had no qualms about nuking the city if things got out of hand. That would leave roughly 2,000 people in the few ships that managed to escape before the occupation began, potentially without anything to protect them if the Battlestars were destroyed. While this much reduced fleet could continue their search for Earth, as Lee suggests they do, any chance encounter with the Cylons in the future could spell the end of humanity. So the Admiral changes the plan, ordering Pegasus to remain behind to protect the fleet. In doing so, he essentially commits himself and the dramatically outmatched Galactica to a suicide mission. But before it could begin, the Admiral's unorthodox plan had to be relayed to the insurgents by a liaison officer who landed alongside a group of Marines and their heavy weapons. That officer was Sharon Agathon, a Cylon who had switched sides. The Admiral had taken a great risk placing his trust in her, but as she was a Cylon, she was able to enter the detention center to retrieve the launch keys for the civilian ships. After 3 episodes of following the occupation, of watching the losses and pain inflicted upon the settlers, of watching frustrated preparations by the Admiral, the battle finally begins with a full-blown uprising on New Caprica. Weapons caches are broken out, alarms blare, raiders take to the skies. As the settlers execute their evacuation plans, the Cylons struggle to gain control of the situation, and then they get word that 2 Battlestars have shown up at the edge of the nebula. In reality, these were decoys, deployed by Galactica's Raptors far from the planet to draw the base ships in orbit away from the vulnerable civilian ships on the planet below. This deception was also necessary to limit how much direct combat the Admiral ships needed to engage in, which was all the more important now that only Galactica was taking part in the rescue. However, the raiders on the planet still posed a significant threat to the evacuation, which was where the next step of Adama's plan came in, and one that we as viewers had not been privy to until this moment. In one of the most amazing sequences in all of sci-fi, Galactica jumps directly into the atmosphere high above the city. While wreathed in flames from its plummet towards the ground, she launches her Viper Wing to cover the evacuation efforts before jumping away with a great clap of thunder. The Vipers immediately make strikes on reinforced ground targets, allowing the evacuation to continue to the ships on the ground while being covered from the air. Back in space, Galactica is shown to have been damaged by its atmospheric sojourn, but there's no time for repairs as the 2 base stars are rushing back to the planet without their raiders. Galactica engages them to keep them away from the evacuation, but 2 more jump in. This is too many for the beleaguered Battlestar to handle, and with her FTL drive damaged, she cannot jump away. The fight is lost. But then, Pegasus. Lee Adama, against orders, has jumped in without his air wing, having left them behind to defend the fleet. But even without that, even without half of its crew, the highly automated ship is a force to be reckoned with, and immediately knocks out a base ship with its forward-facing battery. Lee then orders it directly into the center of the base star's formation, pulling them away from Galactica and giving it time to bring its FTL drive back online. As Galactica recalls its Vipers and jumps out to safety, what few personnel were on Pegasus abandon ship via Raptor. Now uncrewed, it continues on, ramming full speed into a base star. Both ships are utterly destroyed, with the detonation flinging the Pegasus's starboard flight pod into another of the Cylon vessels. But the evacuation of New Caprica was complete. This entire story arc is filled with consequences for both sides that the rest of the season examines, but what can be attributed directly to the battle? The obvious one for the Colonials is the loss of Pegasus, a highly capable vessel that would have been a great asset to the much attrited Colonial fleet. But with the benefit of knowing what comes later, I'm not sure having Pegasus instead of Galactica would have helped much, if at all. There was no battle that would have had a different outcome if the ships had been swapped around, as they were typically defined by other circumstances. The main difference would be the compounding damage that the older Battlestar suffers throughout the show that eventually leads to her becoming crippled. That likely would not have happened to Pegasus, but I still don't think it would have had a major impact on the overall plot. What might have had an impact though is the loss of William Adama, as his influence over the other leaders of the fleet was significant. I don't know if a fleet led by an unstable Ty, failing Roslin, and an inexperienced Lee Adama would have gotten anywhere near as far. The main consequence for the Cylons, beside being forced to abandon the occupation, is the rediscovery of Hera amidst the chaos of the evacuation. She is the child of a human father and Cylon mother, which is extremely important as Cylons cannot naturally procreate, instead relying on resurrection via mind download technology to maintain their numbers. Hera's importance only increases from here as she becomes a major catalyst for events later down the line. From a narrative standpoint, the Battle of New Caprica is exceptionally well presented. The events of the battle itself may be short compared to the multiple episodes of build-up before it, but that build-up gets paid off. While we, the audience, may not know the full scope of the plan, we know the stakes. We know the capabilities of each side and what everyone's objectives are. Everything gets fulfilled in a satisfying manner, and there's even the odd red herring for what might go wrong but ultimately doesn't, like the decoy deployment practice. Those elements manage to build up the tension, but still leave room for the audience to be blindsided by the surprises like the Adama maneuver or the arrival of the Pegasus. While the latter is almost telegraphed when we see Lee expressing his doubts about staying away, the former comes completely out of nowhere, and it is excellent. It's one of the most memorable moments of the whole show, which is partly down to it being a surprise. One thing the battle doesn't do very well is show the way space combat works in the setting, thanks to the unique situation, which is fine. Space combat has been well established in previous seasons, and not every battle needs to be a by-the-numbers affair. If they were, it would probably get boring. What this battle excels at is demonstrating unorthodox techniques like deception, and the unique and iconic use of the setting's FTL travel. While the consequences of the battle may be hard to tangle out from the overall new Caprica story arc, I don't think that's particularly important. The battle is just a small part of that arc. Its repercussions being less impactful than those from the occupation just makes sense. Both factions in the story are deeply changed, deeply scarred after the events on the planet, planting the seeds for long-term change and the ultimate conclusion of the story. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our frigate and spacefighter design reference books. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.